Good morning. Today on Spotlight, a conversation with Gary Peters, Michigan's Democratic U.S. Senator from Detroit. He's home for the Thanksgiving holiday recess and has a lot to say about health care, the Trump impeachment investigation, the presidential race for the White House, and Senator Peters' own re-election campaign for next year, which is already drawing lots of attention and a whole lot of money. It's Sunday, December the 1st. I'm Chuck Stokes, and this is Spotlight. U.S. Senator Gary Peters, my guest today on Spotlight, certainly no stranger to this program, no stranger to you, the audience, and certainly a lot to talk about. Senator, thank you for coming in. I would be remiss if I didn't say happy birthday. December 1st is indeed your birthday. So anything special planned for today?
Well, just with family. So it's going to be nice. But, I don't try to celebrate birthdays anymore like I used to.
Hey, you better try to celebrate them.
Well, that's true.
It beats the alternative, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, every day is a blessing. There's no question about it.
All right. Appreciate you coming in. A lot going on. Let's start with some things that you've been very involved in. Agent Orange. You're very concerned about this, and you've written a letter to the Office of Management and Budget, concerned that the Trump administration is impeding the ability to be able to serve some of the veterans that may have been affected with Agent Orange.
Absolutely. It's a big issue. It's been a big issue for some time. As you know, Agent Orange was a defoliant that was used very widely in Vietnam. Many of our service members who were there serving were impacted by it, or were inhaling it or in contact with it, and have had a whole host of health problems as a result. So a number of illnesses and that are associated with it are covered by the government and the VA to make sure folks get the treatment that they certainly deserve after being exposed to that agent. But the list has been capped. We've been working to expand that list.
Why? Do you know? You wrote the letter
right
in November, I believe on November 8th, and you sent it. Have you gotten a response?
We still haven't received a response, and we're very frustrated with the Trump administration and the fact that basically if it deals with hypertension, bladder cancer, Parkinson's, there's medical evidence now that shows that it can be linked to exposure to Agent Orange, but that has not been expanded by the government. The only thing we have heard, and we've heard this from the Trump administration, is just too expensive to expand it, and that's unacceptable. We're talking about.
You think it's a cost factor for them?
That's what they're claiming. We want to get to the bottom of that, but cost should not be a factor. If you are a member of the military and you've served and you are now suffering from a disease related to your service, the taxpayers of this country stand behind the men and women who have served their country with honor.
How does this fit into, or does it fit into, earlier in the year, he signed the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act. The president signed that. That's something that you push for.
Absolutely.
So there's obviously bipartisan support on that.
Right.
Does this fit up under that, and do you see this as a violation of that act?
Well, it seems to be inconsistent because certainly the Blue Water provision was great, something we've been working on for quite some time, so that's very positive. That's why it just raises a whole host of questions. Why do we see this inconsistency where the administration's leaning in to help us and veterans in certain areas and not in others? We need to do it across the board. It should make a difference. If people have been impacted as a result of their service to their country, we need to stand behind them and make sure that they get the services and the benefits that they've earned and certainly deserve.
If indeed this is a cost factor, do you have any indication of how much more expensive it would be to make sure that these individuals are covered?
Well, we know that you could be talking up to 80,000 service members across the country, so there would certainly be cost. A lot of it depends on where they are in the disease, what needs to be done, but I think the question is we have to stand behind our veterans, bottom line.
You have bipartisan support on this?
We will be getting more bipartisan support. Right now, it's just a letter from myself and some of my Democratic colleagues, but we're hoping to get broad bipartisan support.
In this very partisan world that we live in, and certainly Washington that you have to operate in, wouldn't it help to be able to have somebody else across the aisle
Absolutely.
to be able to put pressure on the Trump administration, and that he may react quicker to a Republican senator versus a Democratic senator?
Well,
shouldn't necessarily be that way, but
that's
the way Washington seems to operate.
It is unfortunate. And whenever I put legislation forward, I always work any way I can with a Republican co-sponsor and take great pride in working in a bipartisan way. But when you're talking about veterans, this should not be a partisan issue. This should just be what's right and wrong.
Diabetes costs. Your concern with that is what?
Well, and this is bipartisan legislation. I'm working with Shelley Capito from West Virginia. We're dealing with the issue of diabetes, which is a disease which impacts in Michigan around 800,000 people. It is a disease that you can often postpone or actually deal with if you do it early. And so the legislation that we have proposed is that we should allow for therapeutic nutrition therapies to be used for Medicare patients before they actually get the disease. Right now, those types of treatments are provided to folks once they have the disease, and it's important to do that. But we know that nutrition therapy can help prevent the onset of diabetes in the first place, and Medicare should pay for treatment for folks who have been diagnosed with pre-diabetes. It's the right thing to do in two respects. One, it is cost effective. It's a lot cheaper to prevent someone from getting the disease than waiting till they actually have it, so it'll save taxpayer money. And then just which probably most importantly, from a quality of life issue, if you don't have the onset of diabetes and you can prevent that, then that's going to increase the quality of life for people in our state.
I was looking at some of the figures, correct me if I'm wrong. It says that the number of Americans with pre-diabetes is about 84 million Americans, and the number of people actually with type 2 diabetes is about 30 million. Those are astronomical figures, especially the pre-diabetes. So what you're suggesting is that 84 million figure, that if we don't address that on the front end in some way, shape, or form, then it's going to balloon on the back end. Perhaps.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what happens with any of these chronic diseases is that they're very expensive. Obviously, again, quality of life issues for the people, but they're very expensive to deal with once you have it. And if you have a healthcare system, and I'm a big believer that we have to have a healthcare system, not just a sick care system. Obviously, if people get sick, we want to make sure that they have access to the medical care necessary. But we should make every effort to keep people healthy in the first place. It ends up saving money, and it's just better for the patient as well.
Senator, we're going to take a break, and we'll hurry right back with some more health-related questions.
Good.
We'll be right back. Stay with us. As part of the Homeland Security Committee that you're on, you're taking up the rising cost of prescription drugs because you say that is a national security issue. Now, there are a lot of people that will say, wait, that doesn't sound like a national security issue. How so?
Well, actually, the report that we're working on deals with drug shortages, and drug shortages also lead to rising costs. But the shortages of prescription drugs is a national security issue that we need to address. And I say that because some of the critical drugs that are necessary for Americans are no longer produced in the United States. In fact, a majority of some of those drugs are produced in places like China and India.
I saw a figure of 80% of the ingredients for a lot of those drugs are China and India?
Absolutely.
How in the world do we get ourselves in that position?
It is a precarious situation, which is why we raise this to a homeland security issue, as to how are we so dependent on countries for medicines that are so essential to us. And an example of how this is a national security issue is that we are concerned about pandemics, which of course are diseases that will go across the world. We have those periodically in the world. Some of them can be devastating. And yet some of the antibiotics and some of the basic medicines that you would use to treat a pandemic are almost exclusively produced in China. And should we have a situation like that, and I would say it's probably just when we have it, not if we have it, you can imagine that the Chinese would provide that medicine to their own citizens before they would provide it to anyone else, which would put us in a very precarious situation.
So you're saying we're essentially making our own citizens vulnerable by this, and that could come back to haunt us if indeed someone wanted to use that against us.
Either against us or just in a natural pandemic that occur. But we'd also have to be concerned about biological weapons. In fact, we had a hearing just last week in the Armed Services Committee. I'm the ranking member of Emerging Threats and Capabilities. We're concerned about biological agents that could be used against U.S. citizens. And if you have that situation, you want to make sure that you have the medicines necessary to treat those attacks. made in the United States, manufactured in the United States. But if there's a natural pandemic, you're going to want that as well.
We seem to be getting more and more notifications, particularly about blood pressure medicines, the ones that I can most readily remember, where we're getting the recalls. How concerned are you about this?
Well, we're very concerned, and that's why you need to have adequate inspections of those manufacturing facilities. And that means surprise visits, very vigorous oversight to make sure it's done properly. And what we're finding that if they're manufactured in the United States, you'll find a lot of that happening, as it should. But if they're manufactured overseas, it's not as robust as it should be.
When you get them coming before your committee, don't you ask them, why in the world can't we make this and make it for as cheap as we're making it elsewhere, and also making sure that the safeguards are in place for our own citizens?
So one piece of legislation I'm working on in a bipartisan way says if you are a drug company with a brand name drug and it's protected under patent, but if those prices continue to go up at a rate well above the inflation rate, then your patent is going to be shortened so we can bring in more competition into the marketplace to make sure folks are getting good quality drugs, but at a competitive price, and that you need a robust market in order for that to happen.
All right, we need to take a little break. We'll come back and we'll talk a little politics. We'll be right back with U.S. Senator Gary Peters. And welcome back. Michael Bloomberg, a few days ago, jumped into the presidential race on the Democratic side. What do you make of this very crowded field, and are you ready to endorse any of them yet?
Well, first off, it is crowded.
Because they may have an effect on your race next year.
Well, certainly we want to have the strongest possible candidate running for president, without question. But I think the fact that we have so many people running is also an indication that the Democratic Party is clearly a big tent party.
You think that's good?
At this point, I would like to get it narrowed down a little quicker, but certainly having folks in the race out there competing in the marketplace of ideas is a good thing. But I would like to see that, I'd like to see it get narrower quicker so we can focus on really the true leaders in the race.
Bloomberg jumping in, some would say late, when we already have a whole bunch of other candidates that have been out there doing debates. Is that good, or is that potentially bad? What does that suggest to you and to Democrats?
Well, I think you see candidates that are getting, because they have a different lane that they want to run in, and they think that they have a package of ideas that will resonate with voters that may not be articulated by the candidates that are in there right now. But we'll see. I think this will shake out, hopefully, fairly quickly. But certainly, the first caucuses and primaries just started at the beginning of February, so it's going to happen fairly quickly.
He has said that he will spend a ton of money on political ads. He has the money to be able to do that. He's independently wealthy. Does that speak to the base of the Democratic Party that this would be someone representing the average Joe out there?
Well, that's going to be for voters to decide as to how they take it. But my take, if you have money, obviously that helps. But bottom line, it's about your message. It's about what you stand for, what your values are. I've often been outspent by my opponents, but as long as you get your message out and you're standing for the things that are important to your state, or if you're running for president that are important to the people in the country, you will prevail. Senator,
your take on the tenor and tone of the impeachment hearing investigations.
Our founders were very clear that an impeachment process is necessary as a check on an executive that may be abusing power. They were always very concerned about the abuse of power of the president. Here the founders just fought a revolutionary war against a monarch. They were afraid that a president would take too much power and there needed to be a check. And that's what we're going through. It's a constitutional process, and certainly the facts that have come out so far are very concerning, and they need to be fully vetted as we go forward. And should those articles of impeachment come over to the Senate, we'll be acting as a jury, and I hope that we're all driven by the facts. And I know in this hyper-partisan environment, it's hard for folks to step away from politics, but we have to do that.
From a political standpoint, would it be better to be pursuing an impeachment or a censure? Because if you have an impeachment trial and it gets over and it gets to the Senate and he doesn't get impeached, then he can say it's over and done with. There wasn't enough evidence. It's said and done. Let's go ahead and get busy with this 2020 presidential race. If you have a censure, then a censure is going to stay with you all the way on that political campaign trail. So what might be better politically for Democrats?
Again, I want to get away from the politics because I think this is just too serious of an issue to just think about it in the framework of the politics of one party or another. And I know that's really tough in this environment, but it has to be based on the facts, what has actually transpired, and whether or not a president should be able to engage in this behavior and realize that depending on what happens here, that may set really a new standard for how future presidents act.
Would you like to see a full Senate trial, or would you also like to perhaps see a secretive ballot, which is a possibility? All you need is 3 Republican senators break rank, and you could have that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, it won't be a secret. People are going to go
think that's
on the record.
Absolutely out of the picture?
I would think so.
Why do you think a secretive ballot is not possible or highly unlikely? All it would take is 3. You've got some GOP senators who say they aren't going to seek re-election, so they won't be vulnerable to the voters. And wouldn't that sort of give everybody cover?
When you're a U.S. senator, you have to take positions, and you have to be comfortable with how you vote.
But when we go into the polls to vote,
well,
it's secret. No one knows how I vote or how you vote when you go into the polls, and we're voting for the President of the United States.
Well, that's true. But as a United States Senator, I have an obligation to the people of the state of Michigan. They should know how I vote. They should know my rationale for it. And I'm prepared to take the consequences, whatever they may be, because ultimately when I vote and when I look in the mirror before the vote, I vote in a way that I believe is right for Michigan and something that I believe is the correct decision to make.
All right, we'll take one last break. We'll hurry right back with some final questions on your birthday. We'll be right back. You will be one of 2 Democratic senators running next year for re-election in states that President Trump won. You have an announced opponent, John James from Farmington Hills. He ran against your colleague, Debbie Stabenow. Didn't do too bad, but he didn't win, so now he's coming after you. Why should the voters vote for you instead of him, and how concerned are you with his candidacy?
Well, I'm going to be running on the work that I've done as a U.S. Senator. You know, I'm proud to say that objective measures of my performance have said and have ranked me as one of the most effective members of the U.S. Senate, also one of the most bipartisan members of the U.S. Senate. And I think that's really what the folks in Michigan want. They want a senator who is going to keep an open mind, willing to work with the other side and find common ground, although I'm a proud Democrat and have very specific values related to that. I'm also willing to work across the aisle to find common ground.
They're already spending political ads against you, at least $1 million, maybe more. You know, the count seems to be changing every day. You've got a pretty good coffer out there to defend yourself with these political attacks.
Well,
I see you have your ads up on the air as well.
Well, you talked about it. We do have an out-of-state billionaire who's a huge supporter of President Trump, who is supporting my opponent, because my opponent supports President Trump 2,000%, which is an awful lot. And so I expect that you're going to see an awful lot of money coming into the state. But as we talked about earlier in the program,
you going to tie him to Donald Trump throughout that campaign, and will he perhaps rise or fall based upon his support of Donald Trump?
Well, I'm not going to tie him. I think he's already tied himself to Donald Trump, so I'll let him continue to do that. But it's not about how much money you have. It's about making sure that voters know who you are. They know your message and what you stand for. So I fully expect that the other side will have a whole lot more money than we do. But that's okay, because I'm proud of representing the state of Michigan, and I'm proud of my record. And we're going to campaign aggressively.
The ads supporting him say that watch out for Gary Peters, the senator from Michigan, particularly as it relates to the Green New Deal. What is your position on the Green New Deal?
Well, certainly, I believe that climate change is a significant issue. In fact, it's an existential issue for our planet. We need to deal with climate change. We need to deal with it aggressively, and we also have to understand that time is not on our side. We're seeing changes that are going forward at not a linear rate, but an exponential rate that must mean that we lean in. But I think that as we go forward, you need to have actually concrete legislation to make that difference. You talk about autos, something that I'm very passionate about. I work very closely with the auto industry, and we're seeing big changes in that industry. And one of the biggest changes is the move to self-driving automobiles, which will be the biggest thing in the auto industry since the first car came off of the assembly line. And folks will tell you, the engineers will tell you, as they're designing self-driving automobiles using artificial intelligence and machine learning to pilot these cars, that the ideal power plant is electric. So that will be the future based on engineers. If you look at General Motors, they have plans for many electric models coming out in the future, Ford as well, FCA. So you're going to see the industry change, but that's part of the natural evolution into self-driving, which I will say the biggest benefit of self-driving will be safety benefits, that we are going to be hopefully able to eliminate most car crashes. When you consider that 95% of all car accidents are the result of human error, if you can take the human error out of driving, you will save thousands of lives. Today, nearly 40,000 people die on our highways every year. If we're able to change that equation and save thousands of lives, that's going to be a big deal.
Do you want zero net emissions by 2050? And you think that's possible?
We have to push the technology as aggressively as we can, but I believe that we can do that through
So they're right
investing.
about what they're saying in terms of you and your support for zero net emissions?
Well, we've already seen our own electric utility companies have very ambitious schedules, and they continue to move in very aggressively. You're finding corporate America understands that climate change is an existential threat, and they are moving aggressively in doing that and in creating more efficient vehicles, making sure our buildings are more efficient. I think there's a lot that we can do, and we should look at this as an economic opportunity to drive our economy while also doing the right thing for the environment. But I think the key factor is that we should not look at climate change as simply a threat, but really an opportunity to make our economy stronger and make sure jobs are here in the United States and not being exported to countries around the world.
Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah,
Happy birthday once again.
I
hope you had a great Thanksgiving, you and your family. Long road between now and next November. I'm sure we'll get you back many times between now and then.
Good. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we want to thank you at home for joining us. I'm Chuck Stokes. We'll be back next week with more newsmakers in the spotlight. We hope you have a great week.